Recently, I posted a Q&A post on my Instagram and Facebook, and I got a quite interesting question there, which might be more interesting for musicians, but I think it could be interesting for other people too. And this is the question: what's your primary instrument? I imagine you play as well as compose, so I guess another question would be, how did you get so fluent in composing for other instruments? So for the first and less interesting part of the question, my main instrument is the accordion, and I play mostly Balkan music and several styles of folk music, a little bit jazz and a little bit classical music too. My other instrument is the piano and keyboards, and my background is a little bit classical. I played several years jazz. I was quite serious about it, and I play my compositions too, which are on the spectrum of classical music, baroque, and sometimes more modern. Okay, now let's get straight into the interesting part of the question. How did I get so fluent in composing for other instruments, as in instruments that I don't play myself? So first, thank you so much for the compliment. I don't consider myself so good in composing for instruments that I don't play myself, but I do try to always learn and get better at it. Now I'm going to list several things that you should keep in mind while composing for an instrument that you don't play yourself. First thing is to learn the instrument's ranges. So for example, if you take the violin, it starts from the G below middle C, which is G3, and it goes up to something like E7, which is 2 octaves higher than the highest open string of the violin. Of course, you can go higher on a violin, but this is the standard range. Knowing the range of the instrument you are going to compose to will give you an initial idea of what you can compose and what you can't. And it will also help directing you in decisions like which key to compose in and maybe some other stuff as well. Let's take the violin again, for example. So if you want to compose a piece in the key of F, F major, F minor, and you know the lowest note of the violin is G, G3. So if you want to finish your piece in F with the note F and you want it to be low, your lowest option on the violin would be F4. So maybe if you know this information, you will decide to compose the piece in G or in A, so it would fit better your needs because you want to end the piece on a low tonic note. Second thing to keep in mind when composing to an instrument you don't play yourself is to be familiar with the sounds of the different registers of the instrument. And for this topic, I think the woodwind instruments would be the best example, because woodwind instruments tend to sound quite dramatically different on each register they play, whether it's low, mid, or high register. So for example, the oboe's lowest register tend to sound harsh and loud, while the mid register sounds warmer and lyrical, and the high register tend to sound a little bit squeaky maybe and brilliant perhaps. And knowing that would affect the way you compose for this particular instrument, because if you have a sweet melody, something maybe emotional in the middle of the piece, you wouldn't like to compose it in the lower register of the oboe, which tends to be harsher and louder. You would probably like to compose it in the mid register of the oboe. Third thing to keep in mind is techniques. Knowing different techniques of the specific instrument you are composing for. And this is the part when you really start to dive into composing for different instruments. Because if we take, for example, the string instruments again, you should know which intervals you can play on each one of them simultaneously. You should know how fast you can jump between notes that are far away from each other. You should know the unique sound that is being produced when you play a high note on a low string. You should know bow directions and bow techniques and what you can do with it. And this part could actually be a great fun to learn, because the best way to learn it, in my opinion, is by listening, studying, and analyzing pieces of great composers. Some of the great composers were actually violin players, like Paganini, Bach, Mozart, Mendelssohn. They either played it as a secondary instrument or as their main instrument, like Paganini. You can learn so much by studying the pieces of the great composers. And what I like to do the most is, when I don't know something, I just go and ask the great composers. So let me show you how I do it. For example, let's say I compose a piece for solo violin and I want a fifth to be played on 2 strings simultaneously. And I want the notes to be, let's say, B flat and F above it. Now, I know the strings of the violin are tuned in fifths from one another. So playing a fifth on 2 open strings should be easy peasy, right? Either G and D or D and A or A and E. Just 2 open strings. But I also know that the distance between the strings of the violin is rather small comparing to the size of our fingers. So since I'm not a violin player, I'm not exactly sure it would be the same with a fifth which is not consisted of open strings. I think that you should either play it with 1 finger placed over 2 strings or 2 fingers stacked pretty tightly above each other. And I think it might be a little tricky to get the intonation right this way, because in violin you don't have frets. A slight movement to the left or right would change the pitch. So in this case, I would go and ask Johann Sebastian Bach for his answer. I would go to his sonatas and partitas for solo violin and see if I can find there any examples of fifths that are not open strings. And as you can see, we can find several examples. So I figure it's perfectly fine to compose it in my piece. You should notice, however, if you take a deep look into it, that Bach usually composes fifths in the low or mid register of the violin. And the reason for that is, as you get higher on the strings of the violin, the distance between the pitches becomes smaller and smaller. So it would become riskier to play fifths on higher positions on the strings because of the reasons I mentioned earlier. And this is how you ask the great composers questions about composing. So the last thing I would do when I compose for an instrument I don't play myself is to see if I can advise with an actual player of this instrument. The best scenario is when you are commissioned to compose a piece for a specific player. Then you can just ask the player himself or herself, and the better the player is, the more flexibility you have when composing for him or for her. And one quick little tip from me before the end of this video. Try not to jump over your head and try to know your limits when composing in general, and specifically when composing for an instrument you don't play yourself. So try to be sure that each and every note in your piece is playable and possible, because you don't want to end up with a really nice piece that is not playable. I don't know, I don't want to end up like this. I hope this was helpful, and see you next time.